Good morning. It's Monday, November 18th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 409 days old. Let's not get to 90 yet. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. It looks like an endgame could be coming after nearly 14 months of war in the Middle East, after sustaining a series of serious setbacks at the hands of the IDF since September. It appears that Hezbollah, the Lebanese proxy of Iran, has signaled to the caretaker government in Lebanon that it is ready for a ceasefire. We don't know the terms. We don't know much at all, actually, but we do know the Israelis will not allow the Lebanese armed forces or the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, also known as UNIFIL, to enforce the agreement that's on the table. Israel insists that it will have the right from now on to bombard Hezbollah positions as long as they're being established. Hard to imagine that this is going to be okay with the Lebanese government, such as it is. Then again, maybe they don't have a choice. So the next few days will be very interesting. We'll be tracking all of it right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Today's guest is David Daoud. You may recognize David because he's an alternate host of this program. He's a senior fellow here at FDD, specializing in Lebanon. He's an IDF veteran who actually fought in Lebanon. He's fluent in Arabic, and he tracks Hezbollah like few others I know. We're going to talk to David in just a few minutes, and we'll ask him to explain what is happening with these ceasefire talks right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Israel's Channel 11 reported yesterday that the remaining Hamas leaders in Qatar have left and moved to Turkey. The move was not unexpected. Channel 11 reported plans were in the works last week in response to American demands to kick the group out of Doha. Qatar denied it. In fact, they're still trying to save face. The big question last week was where those Hamas leaders might go. Now we know. Hamas had a few choices. There was Algeria, a country that embraces toxic Arab nationalism. Also Malaysia, where the leaders are fiercely Islamist and anti-Semitic too. In fact, Israel's Mossad has whacked a handful of Hamasniks there over the years. My bet was on Iran. I liked the optics. It would have signaled that only a rogue state was willing to take in this toxic terror group on the brink of defeat. But Turkey has won the Hamas sweepstakes, or maybe it's lost. Let's be clear, this is a NATO ally, and it's now the global headquarters for a terrorist organization that plunged the Middle East into war last October. I hope the Turkish stock market plummets today. It should, because Turkey has now announced itself as a state sponsor of terrorism. It has been for a while, of course, but now maybe it's time for the United States and our allies to acknowledge this fact. It's time to finally rip Erdogan for being a frenemy. It's time for diplomatic isolation. It's time for sanctions. It's time that Turkey finally, at long last, pays a price. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, an Israeli strike reportedly eliminated senior Hezbollah official Mohammed Afif. Afif was the head of Hezbollah's media office. He was Hezbollah's chief spokesman, and he became something of a public face for the group after Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah met a fiery end back in September. Lebanese sources and Hezbollah officials told media that Afif was killed in an Israeli airstrike yesterday. The strike happened in the heart of Beirut. It was the first strike inside Beirut city limits since October 10th. Here's the other thing that I found interesting. The IDF reportedly targeted the Lebanese headquarters of the Ba'ath Party, the pro-Hezbollah Arab Socialist Party that counts Syrian dictator and butcher Bashar al-Assad among its ranks. What they hit is still not clear. Headline 2, Canadian police raided the home of pro-Hamas activist Charlotte Cates. Cates is the international coordinator for an organization called Samidun. If that name rings a bell, it's probably because the United States and Canada jointly sanctioned Samidun last month for serving as a front for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP. The PFLP is, of course, a designated terrorist organization here in the United States. Samidun has been active in the campus chaos. The group applauded the 10/7 massacre, and so did Charlotte Cates. Canadian police arrested her back in May after she publicly praised the Hamas attack on 10/7 as, quote, heroic and brave, end quote. Authorities later released her with an order not to attend protests for 5 months. Well, 6 months later, she's back in cuffs. On Saturday, police raided her Vancouver home as part of an ongoing hate crime investigation. Headline 3, Israeli President Isaac Herzog canceled his trip to the United Nations COP29 climate summit in Azerbaijan. Why is that a big deal? Because Turkey refused to allow Israel's state plane to fly through Turkish airspace. Herzog's office initially said the trip was off for security reasons, but yesterday reports emerged that Herzog was forced to cancel his planned trip to Baku because of Turkish spite. According to reports, Jerusalem and Ankara spent several days negotiating but couldn't come to an agreement, so Herzog stayed home while the rest of Israel's delegation arrived at the annual climate confab via Georgia on commercial flights. Another day, another anti-Israel stunt from the worst ally in NATO. And bonus headline 4, dozens of Israeli settlers carried out an arson attack in the West Bank yesterday. Here's what happened, according to the IDF. After Palestinians attacked an Israeli man and stole a herd of sheep, dozens of mass settlers entered the West Bank village of Beit Furik. The settlers set fire to a car and multiple buildings. The IDF said a clash erupted in the village during which Israelis and Palestinians hurled rocks at each other. Israeli troops and border police were dispatched to the scene where they used riot tactics to quell the violence. All of this comes as the Biden administration has been sanctioning right-wing Israelis. I can't imagine this is going to help matters. Stay tuned for more possible sanctions after this episode. And just a reminder, the lame duck period could be a time for Biden to take a few parting shots at Israel before he exits the scene. Our guest today is David Daoud. As you know, he's our resident Hezbollah and Lebanon watcher here at FDD. He did a tour of duty in Lebanon in 2006. He actually worked here as a young buck before doing a stint at United Against Nuclear Iran, or UANI, as well as the Atlantic Council. But he came back home to FDD, which is where I think he belongs. So let's talk to him about Hezbollah right now, live on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief, David Daoud.
Good morning, John, and it's good to be on the show. It's good to be back at FDD.
All right. Well, let's start with what we know and what we don't know about a purported U.S.-backed and Lebanese-approved ceasefire agreement. What's the story here?
Well, like you mentioned earlier, John, we don't know the exact details. We did see a leak of a draft proposal that came out, if I'm not mistaken, a couple of weeks ago. It was Israeli Channel 11 that leaked it, that had certain parameters about what the ceasefire deal would look like. And then there was the separate U.S. guarantee letter that would have guaranteed, as you mentioned, Israeli freedom of action in Lebanon to enforce this deal. Because if we go back to 1701, good law, no enforcement mechanism, because it depended upon Lebanon primarily as the host state of Hezbollah to enforce it. And then UNIFIL. What the Lebanese are saying, what we do know that they are saying, is that they're going to reject any form of Israeli enforcement mechanism, which leaves us at square one.
Yeah, and I think that is exactly right. So then why would Hezbollah agree? I mean, is it that beat up? I mean, how do you assess the strength of Hezbollah at this moment? Do they have to agree to whatever's on the table just because they can't afford to keep getting shellacked by the IDF?
I think there's partially that's it. Look, Hezbollah's wanted a ceasefire since October 8th of 2023, the second they entered this fight. Their goal was to get a ceasefire in Gaza. Then they got stuck. They promised to continue fighting until the fighting in Gaza was over. So now their ego is on the line. Their reputation as a resistance that can deter and defeat Israel is on the line. So if the Israelis impose military terms upon them, they look weak. Their utility is called into question. At the same time, like you mentioned, they're losing a lot of people. And not just people on the ground, but their senior-most leadership has been eviscerated. Mohammed Afif was just the last. There was also the commander of Hezbollah's forces in South Lebanon that was also assassinated yesterday. So the longer this goes on, the more pain that's being inflicted upon them. But they don't have an off-ramp, the one that can save their face as this powerful resistance organization, which they market themselves to be. A deal through the Lebanese government could give them that off-ramp. They could argue and say, well, look, we're submitting to Lebanese sovereignty, and use that to stop the Israeli infliction of pain upon them, and then use the respite afterwards to regenerate, especially if this Israeli enforcement mechanism doesn't get the legitimacy or the backing of the international community.
So let's talk about that. I mean, if Hezbollah is able to live to fight another day, do we expect it to come back as strong or stronger? What can Israel do to make sure that that doesn't happen? But I mean, maybe the bigger question is, why would Israel agree to grant them a ceasefire right now in the weakened state that they're in?
Hezbollah could definitely regenerate, even to the state that we saw it at the outset of this conflict. Look, this is an organization that has 40 years of experience, 40 years of building an organizational hierarchy. They have what I like to call conveyor belt mechanisms that would help their regeneration. All the social apparatuses that Hezbollah has that can draw future support. Now, could this take 10, 20 years? Sure. But they have these mechanisms internally. They have backers in West Africa, South America that can provide the money. They have Iran, which has an interest, an existential interest, I'd argue, in not seeing Hezbollah degraded, because this is the tip of the spear of Iranian regional expansionism. So why would the Israelis agree to stop? Israel also has its internal domestic pressures, just as Hezbollah does. Right? The Israeli public has been at war for over a year now. Israeli military doctrine is not built for long campaigns. Attrition is really not built into the system. Look, Israel at the end of the day is not America. America can make infinite war and not need to take into consideration international pressure, because let's be honest, who's going to sanction us? Who's going to cut off research and development deals with our universities? The Israelis are a mid-sized country, right? They have to take into consideration international pressure, not least of which is going to come from the United States itself.
Well, that's exactly right. But again, I mean, I guess I want to just ask you point blank. I mean, should Israel do this? If you're looking at Israel's calculus, on the one hand, you've got a country that's tired, they're war weary, they're ready to have this thing end. I think probably we all are. But on the other hand, they've got the strategic threat from the region. I mean, there's the existential one coming from Iran. That's a problem that'll be dealt with, I'm guessing, somewhere after January 20th. But right now, they are in the midst of a battle. They're slugging it out with Hezbollah. They look like they're winning, right? So why stop? You think that's part of the calculus right now?
I think they shouldn't stop, if that's what you're asking me. If I'm putting on, my uniform back from 2006, they shouldn't stop. Part of the Israeli failure in dealing with Hezbollah from 1985 to 2000 or in 2006, and this is what Hezbollah has been banking on, this is what Naim Qassem and Nasrallah have been saying, is a lack of Israeli stamina. Right? Qassem and Nasrallah have said this is a war of who's going to scream out in pain first. And if the Israelis scream out in pain first for all the considerations that we have, Hezbollah has Israel's pulse. And Hezbollah gets to survive, and not only survive, but rebuild and learn the lessons of this war. This is a learning organization. So you come and deal with them in 20 years. Are you dealing with another 20 years? Are you dealing with a much more powerful organization than you would today? And are you squandering an opportunity that may not present itself until Hezbollah is ready to initiate the fight? Not in the haphazard way that they did on October 8th, but the nightmarish scenarios that we heard coming into this war that, thankfully, because of Israeli intelligence, were eliminated or were neutralized. But again, does Hezbollah learn those lessons? So I don't think the Israelis should stop. They need to grit and keep going on, because this is an opportunity that will not present itself again. But the question is, what does that continuation look like? Is it full-scale war? Is it the reestablishment of a security zone? Is it a buffer zone within Lebanon that is enforced through Israeli standoff firepower? Those are the questions that should be occupying Israeli decision makers, rather than the binary of stop or continue.
Yeah, and I guess obviously the devil's in the details with this Hochstein proposal. If it actually accomplishes everything that Israel wants without having to continue to fight, I suppose maybe they can call that a win. But I've got to imagine that degrading the terror group as opposed to agreeing to some kind of clever scheme is probably in Israel's interest. But then again, so is ending the war. But let me ask you, if we can pivot for a second, I want to ask you about the political scene in Lebanon. The country, as you and I have discussed plenty of times in the past, I mean, it's a basket case. The leaders there are corrupt. They're bought and paid for by Hezbollah. Can they wrest the country back after this frightening year of war that they endured? Or are we just going to see a return to the status quo where Hezbollah calls the shots and everybody falls in behind Hezbollah?
If you ask me, I'm not optimistic. I think it's more of the latter. Even if Hezbollah has been degraded to the point where the Lebanese collectively can act against it, restrain it, prevent its regeneration, collective Lebanese action is almost a unicorn, right? There's the egos of these individual actors, as we saw after the Cedar Revolution 2005, always overtakes the national interest. The other part of it is the fear of Hezbollah isn't broken. And Hezbollah can use that fear to stay the rest of Lebanon's hand long enough so it can, again get grip again and start to regenerate. That'll put us back on a path to regeneration. So I'm not optimistic about what's going on in Lebanon. Hezbollah, as far as we've seen, has not lost enough critical support for it to even lose support internally, for the Shia community to turn away from it in critical numbers where it could prevent regeneration. So the domestic scene in Lebanon, again, we hear a lot of things, we hear a lot of promises, we're told, to me, it's all domestic political gossip, right? We hear someone said this and someone has these intentions, but then when you ask for action, when you ask for numbers and facts, they're wanting. And what we are seeing being told from Lebanese officials, from different swaths of Lebanese society, is that the question of Hezbollah's arms will be dealt with by dialogue and consensus. You have Samir Jaja, who's kind of this holdout, this opposition hawk, saying, well, the government do it. Let the government do it. Let someone else do it. And the others are saying dialogue and consensus, which means let's sit down with Hezbollah and ask them nicely, do you want to give up your arms? I don't think that's going to be a yes, right?
Yeah, that's not going to happen. I mean, look, let's talk about one person in particular. I've heard a lot recently about Lebanese Speaker of Parliament, Nabi Berri. He's a Sunni, but he appears to be aligned with Hezbollah, which is, of course, Shia. What's the story with him? And should the United States sanction him for being in bed with Hezbollah? Is he a major problem? Is he a roadblock that we can get around?
Well, so he is also Shia, but he's from a different kind of Shia. He's from the old school Lebanese nationalist Shia, but he's been in an alliance with Hezbollah because they have been the rising power in the Shia community. They are the popular power in the Shia community. They have all of these social apparatuses that draw more support to them than to Amal. Even though, Birre is more of this legitimate interlocutor when it comes to the West. Now, some will tell you that this man personally hates Hezbollah. That may be true. At the end of the day, he wants to remain the leader of the Shia community for as long as he lives, and to bequeath that position to his son, most likely when he dies. You don't do that by attacking and going after the most popular Shia group, as far as we know. So I think what he's doing is what he did in 2006. He's using the legitimacy that he has to talk to the West, to the United States, to broker a ceasefire that will stop the bombs from falling upon Lebanon. But then in exchange, all we're getting is these promises. Yes, we'll perform. Yes, we'll do 1701. Yes, we'll offer you the sky. Just stop the bombs from falling. Once the bombs stop falling, as inducement for any Lebanese action or promises, will the Lebanese return, will Birre return to where he was on October 6th of 2023. That's where my thinking is, that this is just a political ruse to get the Israeli war effort to stop, and no actual delivery to come at the end. He's always played the political coin of Hezbollah's military coin.
All right, last question for you before we let you jump. We know that Hezbollah is not the same since losing Hassan Nasrallah to an Israeli airstrike back in September. How is Naim Qassem, the new Secretary of General, holding up in his new role? Does he look like he might stay in that job for the long haul?
Well, I think that depends on Israeli decision making, right? Who knows what's being cooked up for him in Jerusalem? But so far, he's trying to do the job. He lacks the charisma. He lacks the authority. He lacks everything that made Nasrallah so popular. I thought it was telling that he gave several speeches in quick succession after Nasrallah was killed. But then on November 11th, Hezbollah's martyr day, he didn't appear, which I think is the first time they didn't have a Hezbollah Secretary General speak. And that's because he's had nothing new to say in any one of his speeches. If you've just had a speech 3 days before commemorating Nasrallah's assassination, the 40 days since Nasrallah's assassination, what else are you going to say when you can't sit there and spin the reality anymore, because the reality is overtaking you, and you don't have the charisma, the trust, the ability to capture your audience that Nasrallah did, to do so, to have that extra authority to say, bombs aren't falling, guys, nothing's happening. So that's where Naim Qassem is. I think he's a placeholder. I think once the war ends, if Hezbollah survives, there will probably be a process within maybe 2 or 3 years to pick a successor. I don't see him becoming the permanent Secretary General the way that Nasrallah did, the way that the nature of the position was changed so that Nasrallah could remain in place. But in the meantime, he's doing what he can. It's not much, and there's a question of whether he survives, especially since the Israelis are continuing to assassinate Hezbollah's senior leadership.
Yep. All right, we're gonna keep watching that. Thank you, David Daoud, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thanks, John.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague Behnam Ben Talablu recently appeared on the John Batchelor show to talk about the destructive power of the regime in Iran and the significant threat it poses to both its neighbors and to global adversaries. Following Israel's recent strike on Iranian military infrastructure, the Islamic Republic has been, according to Behnam, defanged but not destroyed. We'll be keeping a close eye on that. And by the way, if you don't listen to John Batchelor's CBS Eye on the World, you really must. John is a gem, another Philly guy, and a great mind on international affairs. Check out the piece in FDD's Long War Journal, penned by my colleagues Emanuele Ottolenghi and Joe Truzman. They examine Israel's ramped-up efforts to disrupt Hezbollah's supply chain. In recent years, Iran has steadily enhanced Hezbollah's arsenal in Lebanon and Syria through a variety of methods. Israel has responded with a series of targeted airstrikes focusing on key sites in Syria in an effort to disrupt this flow of arms. While these strikes won't completely sever Hezbollah's access to its weaponry, they are gradually choking off the group's supply chains. In other words, the party of God is on the ropes, and that could be one more reason it is mulling that ceasefire. And finally, check out another great piece by Andrea Stricker on FDD's website. Her policy brief this time examines Iran's ongoing nuclear weaponization efforts. According to an Axios report, the Israeli Air Force on October 25th destroyed Talagan 2, a site within Iran's Parchin military complex, where extensive research related to nuclear weapons development was being conducted. With this key facility eliminated and Tehran's air defenses decimated, Jerusalem now has an opportunity to target additional nuclear sites with minimal Iranian interference. I get the sense the Israelis probably won't do such a thing while Biden is still in office, but keep an eye on the calendar. Late January could mean new rules of the road. And that's all she wrote for today. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels as well. And please do support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. The end of the year is coming. Tune in Wednesday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. We will feature Gary Osen, who's a lawyer that recently teamed up with a handful of other law firms to file a serious new lawsuit against Iran and Hamas. This complaint using new documents that have been unearthed where Iran has been giving money to Hamas. We have direct evidence of this. This sheds new light on the attacks of October 7th. So stay tuned for that one. News will be broken. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.